The next speaker is Joep Cornelissen, Professor of Corporate Communication and Management here at RSM. Welcome to the stage, Joep.
Thank you.
And just before you start, is Volkswagen, join me here, Volkswagen, would that be a case study here at Rotterdam?
I think so, yeah, I might actually mention it later as part of the talk.
Okay, perfect.
That's okay.
Yep.
So thank you for having me. I'm going to build on the previous speaker and talk a little bit about leadership communication. I'm particularly going to zoom in on the sort of body language of leaders and how you, in effect, can use your body to be more persuasive. So it's a particular take on communication. So besides the listening skills that were mentioned, besides all the other aspects of leadership, I'm going to focus particularly on how to deliver the message with impact. So what to say and how to say it in a very passionate and animated manner using your body language. So to do that, I'm going to start with the two Steves. So the Steve on the left is probably known to most of you. That's Steve Jobs, who was, besides anything else, in terms of how he was as a leader or as an entrepreneur, he was a very skillful communicator. So he was very effective in thinking about what framing devices to use to bring his message across. And he was also a very skillful performer. So he really used his entire body, all of his gesturing power, you might say, so these hand movements to draw his audience in, but also to be convincing, to get his points across in an effective way. The person on the right is Steve Easterbrook, who's just been brought into McDonald's to basically turn McDonald's around. So the joke that I was going to give you is that Steve Jobs, in effect, managed to sell you products that you didn't know you wanted. And Steve Easterbrook is now in a position where he has to sell you stuff that you no longer want, or at least not in its current format. But why Steve Easterbrook is interesting is that he, earlier in the year, he delivered a video performance, where he talked about his new strategic turnaround plan for McDonald's. And he talked for 23 minutes about this particular plan, where he used a lot of strategy language. So he talked about unleashing entrepreneurial spirit, unlocking growth. We need to have a growth-led turnaround for McDonald's. We're going to have more nimble decision making. We're going to delayer the organization, make it less bureaucratic. And that went on and on and on for 23 minutes. On Twitter, but also in the social media environment afterwards, the critique was very severe. The next day, the share price actually went down, and that was attributed in part to his performance. So I would encourage you to have a look at that particular video. The plan itself may not be bad, you might say, for McDonald's. He probably has a good plan in place. Given how long he's been in McDonald's, he's probably very knowledgeable about the business. But the delivery and the language that he used was not very effective. So what do we know? And thinking about these two Steves, they really symbolize the two aspects, they contrast the do's and don'ts, you might say, of effective leadership communication. So for one, don't use just technical information. Unless you're speaking to an expert, people are going to zoom out. So you've lost your audience, a few seconds or minutes into your presentation, which is what happened with Steve Easterbrook. Use simple frames, so use analogies. So the first two speakers today were very effective in picking analogies, picking anecdotes, using metaphors in terms of moving ahead as a leader. The rest of the employees following or not, hopefully, very close behind you. So they were very effective in getting a few framing techniques in place to get you engaged, to get the basic message across of what they were trying to communicate. So forget about technical. Don't be too technical in the information that you provide. Try and think of a few simple frames, simple analogies, simple metaphors. So Steve Jobs, for instance, he used simple analogies where he compared Apple and Apple's products to competitors. He used simple metaphors where he personified iMac or the iPhone and sort of suggested that meet the new iMac, meet the new iPhone. So that may actually connect to the previous speaker in terms of humanizing, having a more personification language that he used in that particular instance. So use those types of techniques, and also in terms of the other don't there, don't use too much management speak. That's obviously a little bit difficult if you come straight out of an MBA program or out of a business school where obviously we use a lot of management speak all of the time, but if you can declutter it a little bit, use less of that, so less of those highly codified strategy language that you heard that Steve Easterbrook used in his speech, but use more simple, image-based, common sense language, you're bound to be more effective. So don't use words like, we need to move closer to the market, we need to simplify our marketing operations to boost customer loyalty, but just say, what if we would do things differently and make our customers really happy and smile and be able to return to us in the future? So use those more image-based scenarios to depict a situation that you want to achieve as a company, as opposed to just relying on the management speak. In terms of the delivery, also the two speakers today, again, were excellent on this, so don't just keep your body still. Try and use the entire body that you've got at your disposal, including your gestures to bring your point across. And gestures in particular are very, very effective, as we know very much from research with politicians. If you use gestures frequently and also alternate between them, that I'll come to in a minute, you can draw in your audience and you can be seen to be much more effective and persuasive. The other point that I've got on there is that you can also animate your audience or animate your delivery and engage your audience by varying the tone of your speech. I'm not going to touch upon that in great detail. I'm just going to focus primarily on gestures. So Steve Jobs was really the quintessential entrepreneur and also the quintessential leader, you might say, because he really had, in terms of the communication skill set, he had it all. So he was very clever in terms of these framing devices, these analogies, metaphors, anecdotes, storytelling, lists. So you list a couple of items that you want people to zoom in on. And he was also very effective in terms of using his body. Sometimes maybe you might say a little bit too theatrical, so he really had a very performative way of expressing himself on stage. But, apart from that, he was really, really, really effective. And my take is that, maybe he's a little bit of an outlier as far as those skills are concerned, but in essence, every entrepreneur or every leader needs the same skill set. So entrepreneurship may be partly about ideas, it may be partly about luck, but beyond that, it's really also about your communication skills. So can you convince people, customers, investors, employees, basically resource providers that need to come on board to make a venture a reality? So I'm going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, and then I'll come back to the context of leadership. So what is interesting about entrepreneurs is that for them, the pressure really steadily builds up. So when you first have an idea, and you're still in the exploration phase, and you talk to your friends and family about that particular idea, or you talk to close business links and business associates, then you may get some feedback, you may get a sense of whether people buy into the idea, whether there may be a business here, but it's still without pressure, you might say, because if they don't like it, there's nothing lost. Then if you decide to pursue it, your own commitment builds up, you might go to a bank, you might start talking to some business advisors, then at that point, you start to listen to feedback, you also try to figure out at that stage, is this really a business that potentially is going to fly? If you take it even one step further, and if you then have really committed yourself to such an extent that you're going to launch this, and you're going to be put in front of, or you're going to put yourself in front of investors, then the pressure is really on. So in terms of this graph, the legitimacy or the pressure to be found to be legitimate, namely that others feel that there is a business in this, there is a market for it, and we're going to support it. So as an investor, I'm going to invest in your venture. That really steadily builds up in the entrepreneurial process. Even to the point where when you pitch, so think of the sort of Dragon's Den scenario, that TV program, it's the moment of truth. You really, through your communication and everything that is involved and the skills that you use at that point in time, you really need to draw in your audience, and you need to convince investors that this is something worth investing in. So since the sort of late 2000s, there's been some research looking at this. So what happens in particular at the level of a pitch where you have that moment of truth? What do investors really look for? And this is both business angel investors, individual investors, as well as venture capital firms. What do they look for when they assess the performance, the communicative performance in a pitch? There are basically two elements. So one is the extent to which the investor believes that the pitch is well prepared. I'm actually seeing that my time is up here, but that must be inaccurate. I'll keep going anyway. So to what extent you're prepared? So has this person tested the idea? Has he got a viable team in place? Does he know what he's talking about? Are the financial projections sound? So have you done your homework? And the other aspect or the other factor is how passionate they are. And maybe it's a little bit too small, the font on this particular slide, but basically the passion is about how you animate your speech, your pitch, with lots of body language. So it's got items like energetic body movements, rich body language, lots of gesturing, facial expressions, and then also varying the tone and pitch of your delivery. What they found in that particular study is that both really matter in terms of the persuasive impact. Both also really matter, preparedness and passion, in terms of whether the venture idea is understood. In that study, they found, though, that ultimately preparedness is what leads an investor to decide to invest in a venture, more so than passion in and of itself. But the combination between them is important. So turning then to gestures, so in the Chen study that I've just showed, they really looked at the frequency of gesturing. So basically more is better. So if there's just more body movement, and particularly hand gestures, that is better, and that will make you more passionate and more convincing. But we know from research in cognitive science, cognitive linguistics, that there are different types of gestures that are important to think about. So the first gesture is basically a beat, and we've seen that also used today, is where you just emphasize the rhythm of your speech as you're speaking. It's a very effective gesture because you're drawn to my hand, and I know that you're engaged, you're listening at least, and you're engaged by my delivery. The next is a cohesive gesture, which is a sort of speech structuring gesture where you say you start with a point or you close a point. They basically structure your speech as you're speaking, or another way of structuring your speech besides your speech. Then a didactic gesture is basically a pointing gesture. So you see Obama using that here. That could be that I point to the screen, but it could also be that I point to an abstract idea that I want to think about and that I want you to think about. And then finally, symbolic gestures are actually very interesting. That's a category of gesture that you use where you symbolize ideas. So an entrepreneur might talk about the journey that he's on with his venture. They may talk about how their venture is very different from the competition. So now I'm putting myself in a different category from the competition with my gesture. So these are sort of symbolic gestures that help you bring a particular idea across. And they're very effective in particular if you synchronize them with your speech. So if you use a framing tactic like an analogy or a metaphor, so like the first speaker today talked about not being too far in front of your employees. So I'm now making the movement, but I'm also using the metaphor as I'm speaking. The combined use of that is very effective, as we know from research with politicians. The other thing to say here is that with the cohesive gesture that Obama is making there, that's also a very effective one. That's one of emphasis. So really, Tony Blair used this one a lot. I want you to really think about this point. When you use it, make sure that you don't put your finger out, because that's seen to be threatening to most people. So use it in this particular way. So why am I making this distinction? Because when I've been studying entrepreneurs, I noticed there was one serial entrepreneur in particular that I've studied back in the UK a couple of years ago that was very effective in using framing tactics, but also in using these symbolic or metaphorical gestures. We had one gesture in particular where he talked about how with every venture he would think about products, opportunities, invoices, cash. And then he would make this sort of circular movement. And what is intriguing about that gesture is that, and that framing device, is that you're actually saying to investors that for any enterprise, I'm always going to make sure that the loop is closed. That I'm not going to pursue opportunities for which there's not going to be any cash generated. There's going to be no invoices, no cash coming back into the business. So he's taking away any uncertainty that investors might have, because I always have that circular process, that circular loop that I close as part of my businesses. So that got us thinking. So we've since then been looking at lots of pitches, trying to figure out, how do people pitch, and do they pitch differently? We found that some entrepreneurs for some ventures use hardly any framing devices, so they just speak about their venture in a very descriptive, technical manner. We also found that there are lots of entrepreneurs who don't use any gestures at all, so they would stand behind a lectern, or they would not do it, so they would stand still. But opposite to that, in contrast to that, we found lots of entrepreneurs who were very skillful at this. And there was one lady in particular. It's a company. Well, it's not a. It's a label that we used for a company that developed a transplant organ that would allow transplants to be kept for twice as long, so from 24 to 48 hours. That's Organ Solutions at the top there. And in her 10-minute pitch, she used lots of different gestures, but she was very skillful in using these symbolic gestures. So she talked, for instance, about the gesture that I used earlier, putting herself aside from the competition. She talked about a gap in the market that is out there that they would move the venture into. She talked about how the transplant solution that they would offer would be twice as effective and twice as successful, therefore, as the previous solution. And she used that sort of Morris up symbol or Morris up gesture to articulate that. So she was very effective in using all of the gestures, but these symbolic gestures in particular. So then we thought, well, let's try and figure out if this really matters. So could we do a study, an experiment, where we would basically use the same line of reasoning as Chen, so body movements and the passionate delivery matters, but then tease out if these particular types of gestures matter. So in the first study, we used those 4 clips, those extreme cases from an entrepreneurship event that we went to that was video recorded, and then we asked MBA students to rate these performances. And we also asked them to put themselves in the shoes of an investor and whether they would be likely to invest. We found, and then we used the same measures as Chen, and then we also zoomed in particular on the gestures that were used. We found actually similar to Chen that preparedness was still the critical determinant of whether an investor was likely to invest. But we did find that these particular types of gestures, and these symbolic gestures in particular, really helped an investor to better comprehend the basic idea of the venture. So we found a very positive effect there, and we felt this is something that we need to pursue further. I'm not going to bore you with lots of different studies, but then a study that we're doing at the moment where we're collecting different samples, one with investors, one with students, is one where we have an actor present different versions of the same pitch. So one version is where he doesn't use any body language, and it's just a technical, literal language that he uses to talk about the pitch. There's one version where he still doesn't use any body language, but he uses very figurative framing language, so analogies, metaphors, anecdotes. Then there's one version where, again, his speech is without any of those framing devices, but he gestures a lot, and particularly these beats and cohesive gestures. And then the final category is, in a way, the ideal condition, is where he uses framing language to symbolize the basic ideas that he's talking about, and he also uses these symbolic gestures alongside it. Well, what we find in this instance is that we've just completed the study for the investor sample, that investors were really persuaded by the last pitch. And there was actually a sort of a successive increase in whether they liked it, whether they understood it, and whether they were also likely to invest in it. So even the one where he didn't use any figurative speech, but just used his gestures, was more convincing than the one where framing language was being used and no gestures. So I think my time is going to be almost up, so I'm going to just go with 2 more slides. Sort of transplanting this back to the context of leadership, because I've been talking about entrepreneurs. There's a colleague at the University of Lausanne who's basically doing very similar work, but for leaders. So his basic point is that there's been lots of work on charismatic leadership, and Weber, as some of you might know, basically said that charisma is given, so it's a gift. It's from the Greek gift that is given to an individual or not. And he's demonstrating that charisma is something that you can learn. And it's basically down to these communication skills. So how you frame your message and how you deliver the message. So it's, again, metaphors, analogies, stories, anecdotes, listing devices, 1, 2, 3, and also the gestures that you use alongside it. And there's one study that he did, and then I'm almost done, is where he basically asked MBA students to role play and to communicate to their staff that there's going to be a major change and there's going to be something serious happening, and that's probably going to involve job losses. He first let them do it without being trained in these particular communication skills. Then a few weeks later, he trained the same 41 MBA students in those communication skills, and they were seen to be much more effective, much more persuasive. Students putting themselves in the role of an employee were much more likely to follow him and accept even the negative consequences of that particular change. So these techniques really, really matter. So what I want to give to you is that you really think about your own communication skills. We've seen some great examples today here from leaders who show these skills already in action. But think about your own communication skills in terms of, in terms of your speech, whether you're sufficiently reflective or whether you use framing devices. And if you don't use them or not as much as you think, try and reflect on that. Try and see if you could now and again drop one in. And the same for gestures. Try and use your body language a bit more, because there's overwhelming evidence that these gestures in particular, but body language in general, is really adding to the effectiveness of your communication. I promised Tran that I would say something about Volkswagen. What I would say, though, is with thinking about these framing devices and gestures, obviously more is better in the sense that you have a more passionate and animated delivery. That's important if you need to inspire, motivate people. If as an entrepreneur you need to persuade people to commit themselves to the venture. In those instances, it's particularly important. If you're in a crisis situation, you might think that it might be actually more important to have a little bit more of a subdued performance. So less gesturing might be better in those cases, although you could argue that some gesturing could still be important. And what I would say about the Volkswagen case is that the way in which that was handled by the former CEO is that when he announced his own resignation, he actually used a lot of framing devices to talk about the family of Volkswagen and the people of Volkswagen that he was leaving behind. But he didn't use any gestures, and he was also reading the text off from an auto cue. So basically his gaze was not towards you, but it was towards the front, well, almost towards the front of towards the ceiling of the room. So that's where he could have done things slightly differently. So think about your communication skills. Thank you.